Hello, students, and welcome to my video for 2023 on ecosystem interactions and energy, your first unit here in biology at TASM. If you're not a TASM student, welcome, and I hope you find this helpful. Like all of my videos, this is meant just to help students. It is not for profit. It's not for any money. Other people can use it, but you cannot profit from it. It's just meant to help our young students here as they progress to hopefully be agents of change in our world. This video will use lots of Khan Academy content and CK12 content, and that's all available for free on khanacademy.org or CK12. And here are two beautiful ecosystems that I just got to hang out with and to show our wonderful ecosystem diversity here in Oman. Oh, I have some fun. My pointer is now a heart emoji. This is great. This would be Jebel Akhtar, and then down here is Salalah. And we went there. We went to both of these this fall, and it's just been wonderful. All right, let's jump in. Here we go. As you dive into Unit 1, just remember, bio is equal to life. Life is wow. Therefore, bio equals wow. All right, I'm proud of all you've done. You've been working really hard in the class. Remember our retake and assessment policy and what the rubrics mean and the grades, etc. This is meant to be really a celebration of your knowledge. It's not meant to be something scary. So how should you use this video? Well, you should pause it often. You should try the checks for understanding. Here's an example one. This would be a really basic, easy question slide about relationships, but maybe you forget what commensalism is. Or maybe you remember me in class saying commensalism might or might not really exist. You should pause the video, check that out. And then you should apply this, right? I don't want you to just memorize terms, but you should apply mutualism, parasitism, commensalism to something you're interested in, maybe the Wadi cats around here, or our overarching phenomena of what controls sea turtle population numbers in Ras Al Khaimah. You should use the heck out of Google Classroom. That's what the resources are there for. If you have trouble with any of the resources or you want to check an answer key, just email me. That's my job. I'm here to help you. But there's lots of good simulations, models, and activities on Google Classroom that I think will benefit you. You should practice your explanations and your reasonings on family members. Right? If you can teach it, you really know it. You shouldn't just try and memorize exactly what I say, and you shouldn't just assume because you've watched a video a couple of times that you've got it. You should really explain it and teach it to somebody. I feel like my AP students are learning that right now as they go over cell structure and function. For more detailed explanations, remember you can go to your textbook, which is CK12. I like it. It's got those interactive checks within it, and you can like drag items around. You can see how you're progressing with the material. It has cool little science bit videos that give you like real life examples. So I think it's not something to sleep on. And I've assigned you a couple of readings out of there, and then I will post all the correlations for the test on CK12 as well. So how should you study for this assessment? Well, like I just said, use the resources in Google Classroom, check those learning targets, activities, and POGLs, constructing your explanations. Here's a good example, right? Describe carrying capacity in your own words. Don't just give me a textbook definition, but try and give an example of it. And then the factors that affect it. Remember the forest from the trees, the big picture of what ecology is, and us trying to study what factors affect the number of organisms in an area, and then remove any pressure from yourself. This is an opportunity to celebrate, and that is meant to be a pun right there. Here is our course. We are following the Living Earth 3-course model out of California with the next generation science standards. So Unit 1 was ecosystems. We will bridge this to Unit 2 on photosynthesis and cellular respiration via the carbon cycle. And I have a pretty fun game that we're going to play on the Serengeti, and you'll get to pretend to be carbon atoms, et cetera, and cycle around. I think you'll like it. All right. Remember that we have our phenomena of an event in the real world that we're trying to construct an explanation for. And so we've asked questions. What do you wonder? We did our driving question board. We've used lots of models, right? We've make models in class. We did the food webs, etc. We've used some mathematics. A lot of it's been done for us with some online simulations. We plan and carry out investigations. We did the owl pellet, and then we engage in argument from evidence. All right, think back to that simulation with the white-footed mouse. Here's our big phenomena, the sea turtles. Here we were down at Ras Al Jinns, and it was just magical. It was so great to see that ecotourism here in Oman. All right, time for the actual content. So here we go. If you've made it this far, let's keep on rolling. In the last lesson or two, I'm going to review experimental design with you. So let's review experimental design via Robert Payne's starfish experiment. What was the independent variable, dependent variable, what were the control variables, and what was the control group? Go ahead and pause the video. Okay, hopefully you got the independent variable was that Robert Payne removed different species, and then he saw the effect on the biodiversity of the tidal pool. So the removal of a species, such as the starfish, would be the independent variable. He manipulated or he changed that. And the dependent variable is the resulting biodiversity in the pool. You could graph that on the y-axis, right? Which species are left. A control group would be a tidal pool that he left alone, that he didn't touch or interfere with, that can serve as a standard for comparison. Sometimes in experiments, we have constants, such as if we were testing the effect of different music on your heart rate, well, all the music would need to be played at a constant volume or the same volume to ensure fairness. So here, in maybe a constant would be that he can't choose tidal pools that are radically different in size. Otherwise, they might have different interactions going on. So, what did he do when he removed that starfish? We learned that the starfish was a keystone species, and it started to collapse. The ecosystem really became a monoculture of just mussels. So biodiversity decreased or went down is what we found out in that experiment. This is from our AP book, and so it's a pretty famous experiment, right? So here's that control group with the starfish, and without it, the number of species just really plummets. And so that brought us to the Keystone Species concept. All right, how would you set up an experiment on bean germination? So we'll get to do this with Unit 2, and then we're going to measure them with the vernier probes to see if they're respiring. We can grow some of them. It'll be fun. I encourage you to go back and check out that POGL on experimental design. We didn't really have time to do the whole POGL, but it's a good way to quiz yourself. That are you understanding what an independent variable is, a dependent variable, a constant, and a control group. All right, we spent the next couple of class periods after that talking about what is life, and we went over like the NASA definition. We went over, your own personal definitions, and we said that's cool, but is the coronavirus alive? And we talked about how we need to be sensitive about the coronavirus. It has affected people in different ways, and some of them very tragically. But as biologists, it's important to study viruses. And so, let's see. We looked at our tenets of what it means to be alive, some characteristics of life. These can be different in different textbooks, and I told you, you do not need to memorize them. There was metabolism, interdependence, evolution, reproduction, heredity, being composed of cells, and in maintaining homeostasis. So don't memorize these, but what you should be able to do is, given some of these terms, be able to describe if something exhibits it. So I don't want you to memorize and try and think, oh, what is it, M-I-E-R-C-H? But if I do see the word metabolism, I know that means to use energy. So does the coronavirus exhibit metabolism? Or does a mystery organism I give you exhibit heredity or homeostasis? All right. We did a little reading on that. This was right around the time we did the owl pellets. So does the coronavirus metabolize? Not really. It doesn't process its own energy. It uses everything within the cell, but it doesn't really, like you are processing energy right now. You're either metabolizing your breakfast, your lunch, or your dinner to rearrange building blocks in your body to grow bigger. So the coronavirus doesn't really Does it display interdependence? Is it reliant upon its environment? I'd say for sure, right? This one it definitely does. Not only does it have to dock with these ACE2 receptors to then be brought into the cell, but drastic changes in pH or temperature would affect it as well. Almost everything has to interact with its environment. Everything that's alive definitely does. Does the coronavirus evolve? Well, we've seen so many different strains, right? We've seen Delta, Omicron, and all the original strain. So, yes, it definitely evolves. And this is a good example of a phylogenetic tree of the virus over time. Does it reproduce? Sure does. Makes lots of copies of itself, but can it do it on its own? Not really, right? It has to use your proteins inside of your cells. It can't just go and make copies of itself without being able to have your building blocks and your machinery. It'd be like if you wanted to make a sandwich, but you didn't have a kitchen, you had to go use your friends. Does it display heredity? Well, yeah, the coronavirus has genes. It's a RNA-based virus, so it's going to have a strand of RNA that serves as its genetic material. Part of that's going to code for the spike protein. Part of it's going to code for the envelope protein, and those genes accumulate mutations, and those mutations that help the virus be able to stick around or evade the immune system are selected for over time. So it's displaying some of the characteristics of life. Is it composed of cells? And I would argue here, no. The coronavirus is what we call an obligate intracellular parasite. All viruses are. They have to live. They have to use cells to reproduce, to make copies of themselves, and they need your building block materials. So it is not made of its own cell. Does it display homeostasis? Well, what is homeostasis? Homeostasis means similar to standing still, or in other words, keeping a stable internal environment. So if I get hot, then I'm going to sweat to cool down, like I do all the time when I go running. It has been tough here. If I get cold, I'm going to shiver to warm myself up. I drink too much water, my body's going to send out hormones for me to use the restroom. I don't drink enough water, my body's going to retain what water I have and tell me I'm thirsty. So, all diseases are disruptions to homeostatic mechanisms. And I looked it up on Ask a Biologist at Arizona State University. And they say viruses have no way to control their internal environment, and they do not maintain homeostasis. All right. So that was the characteristics of life. Biology is the study of life. And so I think it's important that we went over it. And then we also reviewed experimental design because it's always important to be able to set up our experiments. And now we're on to ecology. And that's the study of organisms, how they interact with each other and their environment. So look at this ecosystem here. This is down by the Marina Bandar Al Roda. And it's a beautiful beach and then these coral reefs. And so these coral reefs are these just wonderful ecosystems that we have access to here in Oman. All right, we started out with the red panda, and I did that because I think the red panda is super cute. And then we talked about characteristics that would influence its carrying capacity. So the red panda ecosystem is here in a bunch of countries I haven't gotten to go to yet, but I really hope to, in East Asia and temperate forests. They are endangered. There's less than 10,000 of them left. And we said, well, what determines how many red pandas there are, or how large the red panda population can grow? And these are all of our titans of science that are going to help us throughout this unit. We came up and we went through lots of lessons, and we got a pretty big vocabulary list. I'm not interested in you sitting there and memorizing all these words. I'm interested in you being able to use them to make arguments about carrying capacity for species. For instance, maybe you researched an invasive species like the fox or a lizard or something that really decreases carrying capacity for a certain organism. All right. You did some pictures in class of your own ecosystems that you like. It didn't work too well. I used Google questions, but I think you got the hang of it. We're just trying to look at different ecosystems throughout the world and some of the biotic and abiotic factors in them. So, what determines how many species live in a given place or how large each population can grow? I totally took those questions from the HHMI video. Some animals are more equal than others. Some of you caught up on that George Orwell reference. It might help you to watch that again if you want to review Keystone Species and Trophic Cascades. And I just want to encourage you to always wonder, keep thinking about it. All right, let's get into using some of those vocab terms to be able to justify an explanation for the carrying capacity for an organism. So comparing and contrasting biotic and abiotic factors. Go ahead and do that. You can pause the video. Biotic factors are going to be things that are alive, right? They got that prefix bio, that means life. Fungi, plants, protists, other organisms, animals, bacteria. Abiotic factors are going to be things that aren't alive, but that do influence life, such as air, right? We'd be in a lot of trouble if we didn't have oxygen, light, temperature, water. Abiotic factors and biotic factors together make ecosystems, and we can't live without one or the other. All right. Can you compare and contrast exponential growth and logistic growth? Can an elephant show exponential growth? That's what Charles Darwin famously argued, and the answer is yes, right? Exponential growth, any organism is capable of it. They can keep reproducing, and they'd eventually fill up the entire planet. But no organism can go through exponential growth forever because they eventually run out of resources. And that is why we then turn into logistic growth. And logistic growth is where we go from a J-shaped graph to an S-shaped graph. So I would say here, I'm going to use my pen, that this part of the graph is really exponential. And as we get up here and it levels off, this is starting to show logistic growth. And so this is that S-shaped curve. Logistic growth levels off at carrying capacity, and many, many, many factors influence carrying capacity. All right. How do humans affect it? Can you compare and contrast R and K selected species? I try to be careful in class to tell you one is not better than the other. These are just their products of evolution. Our selected species would be like flies. They have a short lifespan. They're able to reproduce, to reach reproductive maturity, the ability to have more offspring very quickly. They have many reproductive events. They often don't take care of their offspring. And this is a way that they reach carrying capacity and grow exponentially. Our selected species often grow exponentially faster. And then they can also often overshoot their carrying capacity, right? Because they reproduce so quickly. And then they'll kind of fluctuate around it. K-selected species would be like us, humans, right? We live for a long time. It takes a while to reach reproductive maturity. We have a relatively few number of reproductive events, few offspring, and then we invest a lot of care in them. Like your parents have invested a lot in you. And so this would be we would be K-selected species. One's not better than the other. It's just different strategies that organisms had to reach carrying capacity. All right, can you describe density-dependent and density-independent factors that affect growth? Density-dependent factors depend upon the density of the population. Density is like the number. So as the population of TASM grows, if we were to suddenly grow to 500 students in a high school or something, there'd be a lot of competition for lockers and for space. The hallways would be super crowded. Nobody could get past Miss Kelly's office. You'd all need Miss Kelly, right? Those are density-dependent factors that would affect you because of the population size. These can be the result of biotic competition, and they can also be the result of taking up abiotic factors in the environment as well, such as water. Density-independent factors do not depend upon the population. So I'm reading Into the Thin Air right now for the book challenge about the hurricane that hit Galveston, Texas, right? And so that didn't depend upon the population size. That was a natural disaster that came and wiped out tons of organisms, or maybe a forest fire would be an example as well. So now that you have a couple of population growth concepts and vocab down, can you go back to that white-footed mouse carrying capacity and describe the factors that affected it? What affected it the most? And so this is what it looked like. We did it in class. It was pretty fun. We looked at, well, if we add, chipmunks, are the chipmunks going to eat the white-footed mice? No, but they eat the food that the white-footed mice were using, and so it lowered the carrying capacity. We changed temperature. If we added predators, how did that interact with the system? And that was pretty fun to check out. All right, food chains. Pause for a second here. We're back. A student from last year just stopped by. They say hello. Okay. Food chains. So, can you make a food chain? Can you make a food web? How is energy transferred on average each level? Why is this? And what are some implications of your findings? It would be especially cool if you could do this for the ecosystem picture that you liked or that you selected. We did this with cards from Darien, Panama, which was pretty fun. You might have learned about it in Agouti or Tapir, or Gorongosa, this wonderful park in Mozambique. And you made beautiful food chains, and then you put them together and you made food webs. And then you also got to have ecological disturbances. And a lot of those would be good examples of density independent factors, or maybe density dependent factors that happen. At the bottom of a food chain, we have our producers. And as producers are going to use sunlight or maybe chemical energy from vents in the ocean to make food, right? So they started off. We can't make our own food as humans. It'd be awesome if we could. We could just go outside and photosynthesize and never have to worry about eating. But unfortunately, we can't. There will then be herbivores or primary consumers that eat the producers. Herbivores herbivores only eat producers, whereas omnivores can eat both producers and consumers as well. So here in this example, the mollusks are the primary consumer. So here the deer are eating these green plants or the insects. This would be the first trophic level, the green algae. The primary consumer is the second trophic level. Here, the slimy sculpin is going to be the third trophic level, or what we call a secondary consumer. That terminology can be a bit confusing, but I'm not too worried about you differentiating between third trophic level and secondary consumer. What I'm more interested in is you realizing that only about 10% of the energy gets passed on to each level. And that's going to ultimately restrict the number of apex predators, right? The number of organisms that can be at the top. And so we've seen that with some of the pyramids we looked at. Here is some pictures of you all in action with those cards. Here's a good energy pyramid showing what I was talking about with those primary producers. If you were to add up all the primary producers, they would outweigh the quaternary consumers by a ton, right? And so there's more here. 10% of the energy is passed on to the consumers, 10% to the secondary consumers, 10% each level. 90% of that energy is used up by the organisms in the level. Let's look at this, say this frog here, right? It's got to go do frog stuff. It's got to run around. It's got to hop around. It's got to send out its tongue. It's got to grow. It's got to find a mate. It's got to pass on its genes. So it's using energy up in its life, and then it passes on 10% to the next level. All right, and a lot of it's lost as heat to the system. So here's a good one, right? We can see this caterpillar, about 33 joules of energy of it will go on to the next level. It loses a bunch to pooping it out. A bunch of it gets used up as it does caterpillar things. And it can be lost as heat as it's going around. So this is a good example of why maybe you should think about being a vegetarian, right? If we lose so much energy each level we go up in a food chain, it's a lot more efficient to eat producers than it is the consumers. And so it's amazing if you think about it, how much grain and water is used up to feed a cow, so that way you could eat a hamburger. All right. That was the green food web. Well, it starts with a green producer. We then did a fun TED Ed activity on the brown food web. So can you describe it and how it's connected to a green food web? And hopefully you got something that starts with a dead or decaying item, detritus, right? And so that is eaten by, say, a worm, which goes to a bird. It's just showing that nothing's wasted, right? 90% of plants make it through their life without getting eaten. But then when they die, they decompose and that could sprout mushrooms, etc. So this energy is then goes through this food chain and it's passed on 10%. One important thing to note as we look at these food webs is that energy goes through the system. So here comes the energy from the sun, and it goes to the plants, to the deer, to the coyotes. It goes through the system. Whereas matter, such as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, or nutrients, cycle within the system. So a carbon atom that was in the air will get fixed into this plant and become glucose. That carbon atom then gets eaten by the deer and it becomes part of the deer and it becomes part of their muscle. And then the deer gets eaten by the coyote, so that carbon atom is now in the coyote. Then the coyote defecates or poops it out and it becomes part of the land and it gets into a new plant or maybe an insect. So those atoms, those elements or nutrients cycle in the system, whereas energy flows through. So if you take away the energy source, if we remove the sun, everything will die because energy does not cycle through, energy flows through. And so we need the energy source to keep us going. All right. Can you compare and contrast the green world hypothesis and the bottom up hypothesis for why are trees green? And so this comes from, I love this film. I just think it's so dynamic. Right. And so in the film, the professor, I believe was at the University of Michigan, asked, why are trees green? The students said chlorophyll. But what the scientist was getting at is why don't herbivores or insects eat all the leaves of a tree? Why don't they eat all the blades of grass? And what they got at is that something's eating the insects to keep them in check. And that makes sense. And so there's going to be top down and bottom up controls. In lots of ecosystems, both of them will be at play. So we did this film and then we practiced trophic cascades with it. Here would be an example of the green world. These coyotes or wolves keep the deer in check, and then therefore the deer can't overeat the trees, and that keeps the world green. That is a top down control. Bottom up thinking, which is what before this ecologist with Robert Payne produced this paper, is what most people kind of thought controlled everything, is that it's just the amount of nutrients available controls ecosystem structure. In some instances, it does, right? And so we talked about that with eutrophication and algae blooms. But here, the amount of grass controls how many deer there can be, which controls how many predators they can support. So that's bottom up. Green world is top down. All right. Can you describe and model a trophic cascade? There's a cool online one on HHMI that we didn't have time to do in class. When we have a review day, I'll link it. But we did do all these with the cards. And if you're in GBlock, my computer died on me, and we got to go to the Commons and do it. And that's kind of fun. And so you should practice these. But you saw that in this instance, the otter is going to eat the urchins. So that decreases their number. That's why we put a negative here. The urchins eat the kelp. That decreases their number. So we put a negative here. Two negatives equal a positive. In other words, these sea otters help the kelp because they control the predator of the kelp. This activity, I approach it a little bit with trepidation because the arrows are going against a food chain. This is a different model. In a food chain, we show the direction in which energy flows. Here, we're showing the effect of predation. And then we did it with the lake, with the bass, and you got to see that the bass reduced this fish reduces the daphnia reduce the algae, and so the bass actually make the lake clearer. All right, what's a keystone species? It doesn't have to be an apex predator. It's often an apex predator, but one that if you remove it from the system, the biodiversity rapidly decreases. And so here you remove those sharks, the cow-nosed rays feed on everything, and the system kind of collapses. Same thing with the otters. Think about these kelp forests. These kelp forests are home to tons of fish, to crabs, to other invertebrates. If you don't have the kelp forest, then you really, really lose a valuable habitat for lots of fish. So the sea otters are a keystone species. Same thing with mountain lions and coyotes. And so you can check out this graphic here to see what's going on. And wolves in Yellowstone. All right. We actually did this earlier, but it's in the slides here. What's a niche? You can also pronounce it niche. And can you describe the competitive exclusion principle? So I said that your niche is to be a student at TASM. That's your job. And so if you were to bring in another species of student here at TASM, there would be competition, and one of them could go extinct. And so that's what the competitive exclusion principle says, is that if you are in the exact same niche, then you're going to compete until one goes extinct. This is important because as humans, we are reducing the size of niches and the number of available niches. And so we are forcing competition and we're forcing extinction. After a big extinction event, such as when the dinosaurs got wiped out, sometimes there's very many niches open, and then that can lead to rapid evolution. All right. Can you compare and contrast a fundamental niche versus a realized niche? A fundamental niche for you as a student could be that you could go to high school anywhere in Muscat, Oman. Right? And this Cathalymus barnacle can live anywhere between high and low tide lines. But when in competition with the semi-balance barnacle, Cathalymus, the brown one, loses out, and semi-balance wins this area. This is semi-balance's fundamental niche. They need more water, so they have to be lower. And then it restricts Cathalymus to this area up here. Your realized niche is where you really are. Your fundamental niche is where you could live theoretically. Why is this important? Invasive species have large fundamental niches and can crowd other organisms out of their realized niche, and it can make them even smaller. The smaller the realized niche, the smaller the carrying capacity, the greater the risk of extinction. All right, we also reviewed ranges of tolerance. We said about abiotic factors that affect your niche. I asked you like how spicy your food could be, what kind of temperature you like. And so here, let's imagine that this is a fish. The fish will have a certain pH of which, if it gets too high, it's too alkaline or too basic for. If it gets too low, it's too acidic for. This could be a problem. You could ask one of our students who did this for the UNSDG project last year about the oceans acidifying. If it gets too hot, the fish can't live. If it gets too cold, I believe I gave an example in class of steelhead trout. And so these ranges of tolerance are important. And there's a cool case study that we'll look at later on pikas and what's happening to them as climate change is going on and affecting their range of tolerance or pushing them towards one edge. All right. Can you describe resource or niche partitioning? This was a little tough. This had one of the lower homework completion percentages. I gave you a fair amount to do. We had Miss Kelly in, and so I kind of gave it to you as a learn on your own. For those of you that did it, I think you found it pretty cool where you watched the video and you saw the zebra, the wildebeest, and the Thompson's gazelle and how they ate at different times. The idea of niche partitioning or resource partitioning is altering the use of the niche to avoid competition. And that avoiding competition will actually help their carrying capacity. Now, the duck, the avocet, the flamingo, they're not sitting there with their brain saying, hey, I need to reduce competition. Right? This is a product of evolution over many generations. And that those with the behavioral trait of being in this area were more likely to survive and reproduce. It takes a long time for niche partitioning to get set up. right? It's part of that intricate web of biodiversity. And so if we come around and build a new Mall of Amman somewhere, or build a grocery store right there, or transect it with a road, we can rapidly or quickly disrupt niche partitioning and force competition. Here's this cool one with the zebras that come around and eat that buffalo grass, and then the wildebeest do, and then the Thompson gazelles. So even though they're all eating the same thing, they divided up the niche, and so they're not competing with each other. If the zebra and the wildebeest try to eat at the same time, then they'd be in competition. One could go extinct. Let's review another couple of instances, and I had some slides in class where you got to pick them. Here is spatial niche partitioning. These are different warbler birds all living in different parts of the tree. So spatial is space. Here's dietary. So these are some other different ruminant organisms. And so here's a zebra. I think there's a kudu and maybe a gazelle or a dik-dik, but they all eat kind of different stuff. So even though they're in the same area, because they're eating different things and they're not trying to consume each other, they're not in competition. Now they could be in competition for water. So they're not in competition here, though, for their diet or their food. Another one would be by height. So the giraffe eating at the top of the acacia tree, maybe different lizards in different parts of the tree. So they partitioned the tree by height. And in time is a big one, right? You have these owls that hunt at night. You have the hawk that hunts during the day. So even though they eat similar items like mice, they're not in direct competition with each other. All right, we're getting here towards the end. So if you're still with me, congratulations. Biodiversity. Can you describe ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity, and how can you help promote it? Right. And so biodiversity is the variety of life in a given area. If you take AP biology with me, we have a couple of equations to measure it. Excuse me. But promoting biodiversity is super important, and that's a huge part of the UN SDG goals, and it's part of talks, with climate change, et cetera. We're in a biodiversity crisis. When we think of biodiversity, you're probably often thinking of species diversity, the different organisms there. We saw in our TED Ed video the ones that are in the rainforest. We could think about here in Oman, we might see you're not really going to see an Arabian leopard, but they're there. You might see Arabian oryxes, sand cats, maybe different fish in a coral ecosystem. We also have ecosystem diversity. And this is just like a variety of different habitats. So if we were to take the ocean here and the coral ecosystems and just blast them all away, like it's happening at Yiddy Beach with that Trump hotel, right? And if we just put down massive hotels everywhere and took away those ecosystems, we would decrease ecosystem diversity. We have pretty rich ecosystem diversity here in Oman because we have, coral reefs, we have the Hajar Mountains, we have desert ecosystems. So it's just a variety of habitats within a given area. And in this one's really important, genetic diversity, the variety of genes. And so by having a healthy population size, there's going to be diversity of genes or genetic makeup, which is important when a species is confronted with a disease. If it's a monoculture, if they're all the same, then they're more susceptible to being wiped out by that disease. And so here's just some pictures of it. The species area relationships. So this is the video we did from ants to grizzlies, and what implications does this have for our turtles. This was a more simple video than some animals are more equal than others, or the concept of eutrophication. But basically, the bigger the area, the larger the number of species, right? And we saw it as it goes up by a factor of 10, it doubles the number of species. And so this is E.O. Wilson, the famous ecologist who came up with this. And we saw how he blasted these mangrove islands in Florida and exterminated everything living on them, and then watched life come back. And then they cut down parts of the islands as well to see the different number of species. And what was interesting is that, the species did come back, but they weren't always the same type. the diversity or the types of species could change. So this is was kind of an extension from that video, and so the video did reference the rainforest experiment and how cutting or isolating um, large organisms like monkeys or jaguars in areas. First of all, it hurts their numbers and it hurts their ability uh, to spread into different corridors. And so fragmentation is going to increase the relative surface area of the edge. And here would be an area, and let's say we transect it with a road. The volume's pretty much the same, minus the road, but notice how the surface area of the edge has dramatically increased. It's almost doubled. And a lot of organisms, like they said in the video, the jaguar and the monkeys don't like the edges. Sometimes at an edge there actually could be greater biodiversity, such as because there's more wind or sun, etc. So there could be different plants. But a lot of times the apex predators don't like it, so it can really affect them. So, kind of what we have found is some of the best ways to promote biodiversity is by having large areas that are preserved, making those corridors where, so we watching the video from up near Alaska all the way down through Canada to Wyoming in the United States. And then, as I implored several of you all, maybe you could be the kind of person that could help to make these corridors where animals can cross roads, and right, so it would go over the road or maybe underneath it to help connect areas together, so that way they're not fragmented. Fragmentation is bad for biodiversity. Okay, and then we're here to the last couple lessons. Can you compare and contrast primary and secondary succession? Primary is when there was bare rock beforehand, and then it takes place after volcanoes. And then secondary is when the soil is left over. You don't need to memorize the steps. There's that cool Bioman bio game on it. But the point being that life does come back. But if you erase the soil, it takes longer. And there's a cool documentary about soil that Woody Harrelson in it. I'm struggling to remember the name of it now, but if you get to take environmental science with me, the loss of soil is a pretty big problem. And so here would be a wildfire for secondary succession. The soil's there and it grows back. And a volcano would be an example of primary secondary succession. Ecological relationships. This should be review parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, and predation. So give examples of each of the following. And so which one of these are it? So ticks eating your blood would be a parasite. Barnacle benefits while the whale doesn't care would be commensalism. Some ecologists argue that commensalism doesn't really happen in the environment. Wolves hunting elk would be an example of predation. And sometimes there can be predator-prey cycles, especially shown by the snowshoe hare and the lynx. Hopefully we'll get to that in class. And then we're all learning from each other. That's mutualistic, right? I learn from you all, and hopefully you learn from me. Oh, we can't forget Rachel Carson. Why should pregnant women not consume sushi? So we did a lesson on biomagnification and persistently organic pollutants. So as those pollutants get into the water, they're absorbed by the algae, which are eaten by phytoplankton and zooplankton. And because the pollutant is not metabolized, it's not burned up, it's not pooped out, it's not peed out, it just stays within the organism. It starts to biomagnify as it goes up the trophic levels. In other words, it becomes more concentrated and it can bioaccumulate in an organism. So as this bird keeps eating fish that have these toxins in them, right, it's going to accumulate this amount of poison inside of it. That poison may kill the bird or might not, but what it did and what she showed with Silent Spring is that it really weakened their eggs. And so you had less baby birds being born. This is an example of sexism, right? She was ridiculed and the subject of much castigation. And, she stood up and she stood up for what's right. You did a little research on invasive species and how they can impact biodiversity. Here's the Asian carp. And I believe this is in the Illinois River, right? And so oftentimes invasive species are generalists. They have large fundamental niches and they can dramatically impact an ecosystem. and it can crowd out the native or endemic species. We are spreading invasive species due to human activity. And we take them and they hitch rides in boats or on airplanes, or we release things from fish tanks like the Colapura taxifolia example that we did in class with that algae. And so humans are facilitating this. Remember that it took a long time for this ecosystem to evolve and to have the interdependence in there. Then you bring in this outside disruption and it can really influence it. So here they're able to reproduce fast. Here's the lionfish as another example. Can you compare and contrast intraspecific and interspecific competition? Intra means within a species, and inter means between. And so we just did this quickly, but it can lead to some evolutionary adaptations. So interspecific competition, so between two species, can lead to extinction, right? And so if um, they're starting to fight over the same niche due to the competitive exclusion principle, one could go extinct. Intraspecific, so here within a species, so these two bears might be competing for a mate, or maybe they're competing for food, that can lead to adaptations in the bears. All right, I've got to go to lunch duty, so here's the last bit. Can you describe how eutrophication occurs in aquatic environments? You should go back to the eutrophication slide. But basically, nitrogen and phosphorus are input into the system. Those are components of DNA. Then the algae is able to reproduce quickly. As the algae dies, bacteria eat it up, and those bacteria use up all the oxygen in the water, and it leads to really oxygen poor or very uh, hypoxic water, and it can lead to fish death. All right, some items we didn't get to, but we will in Unit 2 are biogeochemical cycles. And this is with that Serengeti game. And we'll go back through, and for the ecologists we didn't get to talk about, we will talk about them as well. And we'll keep on working on our anchoring phenomena. Our big anchoring phenomenon for Unit 2 is going to be coral bleaching in the Dominion Islands. All right. I hope you found that helpful. Remember that you can save biodiversity. And when we do our UN SDG project, lots of this comes up in goals 13, 14, and 15. Mother Earth needs activists, teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists. It needs you, students. Take care. Peace out.